You're live, Your Worship.
Great. Yeah. All right, Council, I'd like to call to order this Finance Committee meeting for March 22nd, 2023 with adoption of the agenda. Someone want to make that motion for me? Councilor Cherry, seconded by Councilor Lucio. All in favor? Motion's carried. Adoption of the minutes of the Finance Committee meeting dating back to August 17th, 2022. Does someone want to make that motion for me, even though neither one, other than Councilor Palmer, no one was here. Councilor Cherry, seconded by Councilor Devlin. All in favor? Motion's carried. We're going to go on to new business long-term financial plan. I am going to turn this over to Ms. Moore, and then we can go from there.
Thank you, through Your Worship. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, just checking. I've brought forward a similar package to what was brought forward on the Thursday Committee of the Whole to extend the discussions that were being had around the spending initiatives. With this package here, I have also included the detailed spending initiative applications from department heads for council to review if they have further questions or would like to dive into the spending initiatives in more detail. I can also share my screen here. Just give me a second. Okay, can you see my screen?
We can. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the report with the motions that was brought forward at the Thursday Committee of the Whole meeting that the committee indicated that they would like to have further discussions on the spending initiatives. So here is the list of the operating spending initiatives. And I can flip to the next page as well, which has the capital spending initiatives if council has further questions or would like to change the motion or what is being included in the table that is being recommended to council.
Right. So before we go further, Ms. Moore, I'm actually get you to go back to the first page, please.
Sure.
So council brought forward a motion for a 3% increase in property taxes for 2023. There was two other options, 4%, 5%. And in my mind, we didn't really discuss the differences or the advantages of the other options. And I believe with the participation and the feedback you got for the community, about 50% were in favor of a higher than 3% increase. Can you tell me what the difference would be to the community if we opted for 4 or 5%? What the advantages would be for the city regarding projects moving forward? Can you kind of just give us that in a nutshell?
Through Your Worship, absolutely. I will also, I have the public budget guide open so I can give you the exact numbers here. And so we have a 3%, 4%, and 5% scenario here. The average dollar value per family home based off of the average assessed value of a home in Revelstoke of $708,000 is $57 for 3%, $76 for 4%, and $95 for 5%. And the reason for giving the 4 and 5% scenarios is to try and save and build reserves for bigger projects. For example, the arena/multiplex facility. If we want to have a chance of saving for it and being able to reduce debt in the future, we do need to start saving as soon as possible. And we do have some additional information in this package here of what that would look like for total transfers to reserves. So I'll just scroll down here. With a 3% property tax increase, we will increase our transfers to reserves of 57,000. At 4%, it's 192,000, and at 5%, it is 327,000. The important thing to remember with tax increases is the sooner you do it, the better off you are because it compounds. So, for example, if council were to elect the highest, the 5% property tax increase, we would see an additional $327,000 each year going into the future. So $327,000 for 2023, 2024, 2025, and so forth. So in 5 years, that would be approximately about $1.7 million in additional transfers to reserves to build savings and reduce future potential debt.
And that's setting the tax rate at 5% increase over current, or last year, I guess. But that scenario gives us that 5% tax rate for the next 3 years as well, correct?
That's correct.
So that $327,000 that you're quoting us now has a compound tax over and above that money that you're quoting, or that's included in that estimating with what interest rates are at current?
So this $327,000, it is extra transfers to reserves from what we already do for the next however many years into the future. So it compounds indefinitely unless we were to do a tax decrease. And if the more that we can save reserves up front, the better off we will be in terms of we will have less principal debt taken on and therefore less interest.
Okay, so when I'm looking at this figure, this 327,000 that you're showing here, that's the amount of funds that would be transferred into the reserve. And then once it's into the reserve, there's interest on funds that are in the reserve. Am I understanding that correct?
That's correct. When we receive extra money to transfer into reserves and our reserve balances in general, we invest them into GICs and they do earn interest. And so interest revenue will build in addition to this, if that is answering your question, through your worship.
Yeah, thank you. That's just kind of, we were talking about the compounding of the funding, and that's where I'm going with this. All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Any councillor have any questions regarding the difference between the 3%, 4%, 5%? Councillor Palmer.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Souls. Yeah, just a couple of further questions, just for clarification. So on the 3% scenario, which was endorsed at the committee of the whole, you said that's an increase of 57,000 towards reserves. So approximately 80,000 for other tax things that are in the budget. Is that accurate? Or am I getting that wrong?
Through your worship, here, let me.
And maybe just to clarify, because it looks like the entire increase of, if we went to 4%, the entire amount goes to reserves. At 5%, the entire amount goes to reserves. But the increase at the 3%, because there's only 57 going to the reserves, it seemed that it's for other tax increases within the budget.
Through your worship, I'll help try and clarify this for Councillor Palmer. Our core budget increase is 30,800, which equates to 0.3%. The total taxes increased for 3% taxation increase is just over 400,000 right here. It's approximately 35,000 per 1% of taxation increase. We require $316,000 for the operating spending initiatives. And then the difference between this 400, 316, and the 30,000 is the leftover for the scenario one, which is 57,000. And if I pull up, oh, you can't see the calculator because I'm showing the document, but 135,000 times 5%, the extra taxation revenue will be approximately $675,000. And of that, 327,000 for scenario 3 will be transferred to reserves for savings. And of that amount,
327 or the 600?
Yeah,
327.
the 327.
Okay, right, yeah, okay, thank you. And then further, our long-term financial plan from last year, and probably I should have looked this up, but do you have it on at your fingertips? What is this consistent? What's the most consistent with the financial plan from last year, the 3 year, specifically when we talk about transfers to reserves, because that was it's been an ongoing issue for some time or concern.
through your worship, I don't necessarily have that one on hand.
Okay, yeah, that sorry about that. Yeah, that's fine. I'm just looking for that.
Comparative?
Yeah, I guess just further to what you were saying, Mayor Souls, if I'm reading you correctly, it seems to me that you're, because of this transfer to reserves and looking after the long-term financial interests of the city, that if I'm reading you correctly, you're kind of alluding to the higher increases. There might be some wisdom as based to transfers to
That's
reserves.
exactly what I'm saying. And I want to understand that and be clearly transparent to the community, because I'm hearing from some people in the community, maybe the prudent choice would be now to increase slightly.
Yeah,
And then we have that money at hand as we grow.
right. So in that, and I guess what I was hoping from my last question was, okay, is this messaging consistent? Because if it is, then that provides more weight to that scenario.
Right.
That's kind of what I'm alluding to. It's not critical, other than if during a dialogue that the finance officer was able to find it.
Yeah. Is Maura, you able to find any of that stuff, or is that buried so deep where you need to show?
Through your worship, I have not pulled up the prior long-term financial plan, but I can confirm that consistently over the last 5 to 10 years, we've been trying to build reserves in order to reduce debt. And we have been successful of not taking on any new long-term debt aside from local area service agreements. So like the Big Eddy Water and Thomas Brook for the last 10 years, which has really helped our financial position. And in order to do that, we've had to transfer a portion of the tax increase to help build our reserves. And I do recall in the last few years, there was one that I definitely looked at where it was about 2% was for spending initiatives and operating, and about 2% was an increased transfer to reserves. So to answer Councillor Palmer's question without pulling up the details of last year's plan, that this is consistent. And it is one reason why we did give the 3 different options this year is because we do know we have a large facility that we need to start saving for that will be considered in the next few years, given the current condition of the arena.
Great, thank you. Any further questions, Council?
I think that's good. I mean, it's an interesting sort of, with the committee of the whole having the 3%. And I guess that's sort of emphasizing, how much have we really dove into the details? Because I certainly see your thought on that, and it was a little bit flying by the seat of our pants a bit off the committee of the whole. But and so having this sort of more a deeper discussion, it'd be interesting if the finance committee was actually, say, recommending 5%. We got kind of got two recommendations coming from the same set of people, but yeah.
Councilor Orlando.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. And through the chair, I have a question for staff. There's been discussion regarding the 5% scenario to put it in reserve, and the arena or the forum project has been mentioned a couple times. My question is there a statutory reserve fund or a parks reserve fund to have assurances that that's what it will be reserved for, or would that go into sort of a general reserve fund?
Ms. Moore, comment?
Through your worship and to Councillor Orlando, we're just recently discussing a funding strategy for a new facility for the arena or multiplex, whichever it may be. And with that funding strategy, part of it is coming forward to council to create a new reserve fund specifically for the new forum or facility. And it wouldn't necessarily be a statutory reserve, but it would be segregated from the rest of the reserves. And it would be very clear when council is making motions to transfer to reserves, whether we end up with an annual surplus or we're doing an increase in taxation to build the reserve, that it would be very clear in the plan that it would be meant to build that specific reserve if council chooses to do so. So this is part of the funding strategy that will be brought forward in the coming months as we get into the community engagement with the arena.
Thank you. I do appreciate the response to that one. And I had one more question, Your Worship, if that's okay. Yeah. Through the chair, I guess my next question would be, at a high-end scenario for the forum project, so a larger facility with some extra facilities added to it. Recent reports sort of identified what the average cost per average household would be for example, debt servicing that large project. So my question is coming from the perspective of making sure community members are aware of the impact of these large capital projects. And so the question is this: how much would that be if we were to proactively start saving to reserves annually that amount to offset future borrowing for this project? What would that look like in terms of percentages? Is there a guesstimate for how much we would have to raise it to set it to that 20-year or 25-year payback window?
Ms. Moore, comment on that? Is that question straightforward for you?
Through your worship, it is straightforward. One second, I'm just going to share my screen to a different document here. Through your worship, can you see this Excel document that I have?
We can. Is that clear for you, councillors, to see around the room? Yeah. Okay. Yes, we're good.
Good. Okay.
See that? Yeah.
So recently we have started trying to figure out what exactly this would look like for the community. I know there are some brief calculations being completed previously with the previous director when that report came out in 2022 with the ballpark estimates of the different options. And so we have ranges, and at the moment we have scenario A, B, and C. So there's $5 million upfront, $10 million upfront, or no savings. And as we go through, we have the 3 different options of a new user arena, a new spectator arena, or sports multiplex facility. And in here, you will see this is where, if we are able to get $10 million, which I think is feasible for upfront savings, these are the ranges in taxation increase. So about 7 to 11%, 15 to 17%, 17 to 26%. And this is the average per household in dollar figure of what those percentages look like. And so the more that we can save right now, the more it will reduce these percentages that we later on have to increase for the community. And it will also reduce the average amount per family home that they will see in a taxation increase. These are very preliminary numbers. This is something that we've just very recently been working through, and we're planning on bringing forward to council in more detail and figuring out a funding strategy for it as we move forward with the communications plan to the community. Right now, if the community is wanting to see a sports multiplex facility, our goal is to make it feasible at $1 per day, so around the $360 mark. That's management's goal at the moment, although this is all very preliminary. So hopefully this helps kind of highlight why it's important to save now versus later. Is the more that we can do now, the better off we are with these percentages and these average dollar figures per home.
Okay, so just to clarify or expand a bit on what Councillor Orlando was asking for, so not to shock the community, but these figures, we're talking about $1 per day to a total of, let's say, $340, $360 a year per year for how many years?
Through your worship, it would likely be a phased approach where we would be looking at doing a 2% increase each year for 5 years or something like that. And so it would continue on into perpetuity. But we would look at a funding strategy that phases it in and isn't just all at once being hit to the community. So if council were to opt for a higher increase this year, it would be taken into account in this funding strategy. So they would see $1 a day going forward on their taxes in short and simple terms. However, it would likely be a phased approach and increased incrementally over 5 or 6 years.
Okay, I appreciate that. I want to be really transparent when we're talking about these things, and that's basically giving us an idea of where we're going. And that's kind of why I was talking about what the differences were with our tax increase this year, the 3, 4, or 5%, and what the ability would be and how it would help going forward. All right, councillors, any other comment? Councillor Palmer.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Solzhenitsyn. Thank you for the discussion. We certainly could very quickly get hyper-focused on the arena. There is not a decision, even with this tax increase. And I think just going back to some of the dialogue before, there may be a general intent, but it's not going to be forced because a decision has not been
absolutely
made.
Correct.
And
yes.
So I think that's important to realize that if we do opt for a higher percentage increase, the context with the multiplex is that it's being prudent in advance without that decision being made. And I guess one of the other, and I want to avoid getting into the multiplex financing thing. However, I think they're just because those numbers were up there. Part of the equation that we don't know is certainly as a counselor, I don't expect the taxpayer to be taking the entire burden of the multiplex. So we need to be looking at other funding, and there's multiple ways of doing that. So whether that's through tourism dollars, through other land sales, through other innovative approaches, corporate donations. And the other one I'll just hint at this point too, if we do ultimately make that decision, does this belong in the DCC bylaw that we accelerate so that new development is contributing in a more meaningful way to this future multiplex? So I don't want to go there, but I think this has been really helpful for me as to the merits behind a higher tax increase. I can't say what my position right now, but I'm more receptive today than I was last week towards the higher increase. In the other context is the tax increases. Like, I don't know if there's any other community in British Columbia that's got this low of a tax increase, quite frankly. I don't know if there is one.
Well, I haven't seen any this year.
You were seeing double digits all over the place. And so, it's just a bit of context there as well.
Yeah. And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, and we don't want to. There's all kinds of ways to look at funding the arena, but my thoughts were with higher tax increase now, and if we're to compare other communities, absolutely we're lower. But by the same token, we have to take things into perspective with what our community can afford. And we're seeing higher rates of increase on assessments, those sorts of things. So it will kind of maybe balance or not as we go forward. The thing is, when we're putting money aside for into reserves, that's going to help us with capital projects, and that basically will go back to the community in a way that the community sees fit, whether it means that we're funding new pipes in the ground for water, sewer, or whatever. I want to make sure that what we're doing is we're just not putting that money aside. It's going to be used willy-nilly for anything that comes up, that we're going to have a strategy for that. And I think that's key. Councillor Stapenhurst, you have your hand up. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Your Worship. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person today. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. My question is in regards to any savings that we could possibly have if we really scrutinize the what's in front of us for the new capital projects and the spending, and how that would offset our general capital reserve. I guess two questions. What's the overall status of our general capital reserve right now? And then two, like, how much savings could we put aside, and possibly continue to look at a lower tax rate if we really scrutinize what's on this list in front of us? I mean, we've been hearing from the community about the dog park, about the city hall. We talked about the audio recording studio. Those are just a few examples that, quickly looking at the list where I think we could potentially save a whole ton of money. And I guess, like when it comes down to it, like if I was looking at this from a family perspective, it's kind of like your needs versus your wants. What do we really need right now versus what do we really want? And how do we afford this? Right. So that's just my general comment. Just trying to figure out where we can make some savings.
Okay, so, and I'm going to look at it from a little different perspective rather than us get mired into line by line sort of thing. If it was council's decision to say, we want you to save 1% on taxes, then why don't we state that and we send Ms. Moore back to the drawing board with her directors to come up to 1% savings on that, and then and we move forward. I always look at it from a perspective, and I think I'm going to get Mr. Parliament to weigh in, but we were talking about this sort of thing with taxes, and taxes are kind of that that roller coaster ride. But I think he, with his experience, could explain it a heck of a lot better than I could. Would you mind?
Oh, no, sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. For the last 20 minutes, I've been listening to the questions, and if you're going to make a significant reduction or commit to reduce the burden of the taxpayer, focus on the capital. There are some savings in operating, but being that roughly 80% of the budget is fixed, you got labor, you got materials and utilities, there's a little bit of movement in operations, but Yeah, I mean, council has a right to scrutinize and question some of the capital projects, and maybe there's a chance to do half or defer, et cetera. That's where you're gonna see the biggest savings, but with the budget, it's organic, it changes throughout the year. Every month, you sort of do this ride where you're up and down on expenses, and at the year end, you declare a surplus. You're not allowed to declare a deficit. So if there's an extraordinary item, that requires an amendment. That requires staff to present a financial plan, how to pay for that extraordinary item. So I would encourage council, and I like the questions that I've heard so far. If you want to look at the 2023 budget and see if there's areas that you can save, spend more time on the capital. They're just bigger numbers. Staff have gone through the budget, both operating and capital, with great detail. We feel that being inflation at a national level being just over 6%, by us staff providing a budget that's within that 3%, and some of that 3% is going into reserves, we feel this is a very good budget. There are other municipalities that are double the tax increase because, quite frankly, they just met inflation. So if you were to just meet the CPI in British Columbia in the month of December 2022, you'd be looking at 6-7% just to keep up with inflation. You can always knock out sort of those higher end factors like gasoline and oil prices to bring that CPI more meaningful to our operations. But at 3%, we feel that's a good budget. We provided two other options, 4 or 5%. It's not a major increase as per the average household, as stated by the Director of Finance when she mentions the average house being 710,000. You're looking at a nominal increase. But more importantly, if the council were to adopt the 5%, a big chunk of that goes into reserves, which at the end, council, either we borrow money and we charge the principal and interest back to the homeowner, or we charge a 5% increase or a 4% increase in taxes, build up a reserve, so we don't have to borrow those dollars. We can finance it internally using tax dollars, of which if we were to, for the next 5 years, add a 2% tax increase specific to a arena reserve, for example, that would be just less money to borrow down the road. So anyways, in short, Mr. Mayor, there are some significant capital items that we can certainly discuss. But in terms of operating, I don't think it's going to move the needle too much on the 3%, 4% scenario. Because remember, for each 1% is roughly $135,000. So if you were to reduce the operating by 135, you would drop at 1%. However, you can easily make up that savings with an extraordinary item that requires another 1% or another 135,000, either to match a grant or some extraordinary expense. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Mr. Poorman, I appreciate that, and that's what I thought you could make that clearer than I could. Councilor Palmer, did you have your hand?
Yeah, just sort of further to that, I'm very sympathetic to Councillor Steppenhurst's comments of, sort of this deeper scrutinization. So I'm very sympathetic to that. However, at this time frame and what we're actually, on the budget scenario, and that's why I'm anxious to make sure that we get going on the capital stuff in the fall. So I wouldn't want to be asking staff to find another % at this point. Unless all of council is really willing to put in some all-day scenarios to really do it justice. I see it as a bit of a distraction right now. When we look at the initiatives on the plate that we were looking at last, the general operating spending initiatives, the increase there, I'm generally satisfied with those. And some of them, like the communications officer, I think we've even given that pre-budget approval, so that's kind of entrenched already. And the host compliance software, we're seeing that as so most of these are kind of entrenched. If we want to start opening up the whole conversation about the need for increased staffing, so firefighters on the water side, that's going to be we open up that can of worms. It will be a can of worms for sure. The more benign ones is the golf course, which we had a little bit of a discussion on this grant and aid and anticipating that should be going down. It's when I wondered whether it should have been reduced a little bit in anticipation of these increased revenues that was mentioned, but we're kind of splitting hairs there as well. But when we start looking at the 2024 budget, I think that's when we say, okay, how do we tighten up? And then when we get to the new capital projects, in a way, I wouldn't mind, hitting each one of these just at least a little bit of a level, just like we did with the 10,000 at the committee of the whole with the, and saying, okay, what, is there merit? Is this something that we could pull back on the short term? But yeah, so that's my comments. And, I certainly am receptive to the consideration of going to the 5% increase with the recognition that we're going into this dialogue with the community on funding, whether or not we're going to go into a multiplex or not, but then doing prudent choices at this stage, because that can be utilized other ways if ultimately we choose to do something else. I think it's, we've had quite a bit of dialogue as well as a community. It's been a priority of this council on the social issues around housing, accommodation. It's a big thing. And from my perspective, and it's maybe a slightly different lens, but looking after our people, the people that live here, including the underprivileged, is part of the whole aspect of the multiplex. We can talk about big dollars there, but that's where we need to be ensuring that we are getting that funding from the big corporations, the big profit centers, and so that we're creating facilities for the people here. And whether that, how we can incorporate that social responsibility as a council in that multiplex, I think that's an important question that we need to be cognizant as we go ahead. Because if we do this at the expense of, us common people, then we're missing something, because this should be first and foremost for the community. And yet we have this opportunity, because we're in this recreation mecca, to have funding that comes in to help our people and within the. So based on that, I'm open to this, the dialogue of a 5%. Discussion.
All right, Councilor Chair.
Thanks, Your Worship. I just want to take this time to remind council that we have QP negotiations this year, and we need to prepare for what that's going to look like now with our budget. I also have another question through the chair to Director Donata. If you got a second, just for capital costs associated with the arena, how many of these are needed just to keep the place running in the interim?
Through your worship to Councillor Cherry. So in the budget, we have the arena condenser project.
Yeah.
So that the condenser is up for replacement in 2024. It's working fine right now, but the life cycle will exceed in 2024. So if we don't replace it in 2024, we do run the risk of it failing. So typically that type of project is a 2-year project, where the first year we do the design work, which ranges anywhere from 25 to 30,000. And then the second year we tender and do the actual project. So it's working fine now, but the life cycle, the 20-year life cycle is 2024. So we're budgeting to do preventative maintenance on it. If the condenser does go during the season, it could be a challenge to repair, and we run the risk of not being able to operate the arena.
Okay, I appreciate that answer. It's just, we're looking at budgets, and the conversation keeps going around about replacing the building.
Yeah.
More so and more so every year.
So it's just a risk.
Okay.
With that type of equipment. It is part of the refrigeration system, so it's one of 3 components. We've already done the compressor. We did the chiller in 2019, I believe. This is the last component that needs to be replaced.
Okay.
And it is a significant expense.
I appreciate that. That's it for me.
Can I follow up? Councilor Paul.
Thank you. It's a common question. I think I might know the answer, but if we do this, can we use this in the new facility?
I am not sure whether it can or
Okay.
not. It would all depend on sizing and the chillers, the compressors, and we'd be designing around the condenser. We'd be designing the new plant around the condenser.
Yeah, unwise. So, and Mayor Souls, I guess just on that, like, that's the 325 figure, that's the kind of figure saying, okay, do we take a risk? What's that risk? It feels to me it's fairly minimal, but if something happens and we make a calculated risk, and let's not waste that kind of money. Let's put that aside, defer that to, maybe leave it in the budget in the event that, I'm assuming this is targeted for the 2023. Do we defer that on the long range financial plan to 2025, for example, and say, okay, hopefully we can stretch out an extra year out of this thing.
Right.
And then using that money, again, if we're looking at this multiplex or recreation facilities, that's the kind of thing that I would like to see, how we just pull back. I guess further on that, so there was the arena compressor safeties. So the similar question to Councillor Cherry is that a necessary expense, the 57,000?
So within that capital project, I'm just gonna bring it up. Because I did do that one a while ago. So this is a safety concern that was raised by staff. It has to do with the refrigeration plant. So we currently do have a safety procedure in place for entering the plant and reviewing the control system. So what we're proposing right now is to add compressor panels that display the levels on the computer so that the refrigeration plant can be monitored through the computer in the office rather than physically walking into the refrigeration plant. It was identified by staff, so we are considering implementing it. Having said that, we do have safety protocols in place so they can safely enter the plant as is. So it is one that could potentially be deferred if council felt they wanted to defer a project.
Just to follow up to that, it's one that's, with a little bit of vagueness there, it's probably one that I would say, well, leave in the budget, but staff take a look at that, because if we can keep that, not spend that money this year, and then if we know we're going into a new arena project, then, will those safety protocols, are they adequate to get us by for another year or two as we go into a bigger project, and hopefully have the state of art thing that's addressing the bigger safety concern, because that's one of the aspects of, the new facility it's a 1950s facility that was built with the safety of the 1950s in mind, which doesn't meet what we need today. So.
Yeah, there's definitely some safety concerns with what we've seen around the province. Councillor Orlando, then Councillor Chair.
Your worship, just a comment regarding safety equipment, be it arena or fire department, et cetera, other safety equipment. I put a lot of faith and trust into staff in safety recommendations, and I definitely want to move forward with whatever is recommended. I don't think staff would put something safety related on there if it wasn't necessary. I appreciate the comment that perhaps it could be delayed, but realistically, any new arena project seems likely to be many years off. So I just want to let you all know that I don't want to be the one, nickel and diming on a safety thing, and then there's a tragedy that happens as a result. We've seen the results of just how dangerous ammonia-based arena systems can be. So just a comment. Thank you.
Councilor Chair.
Yeah, just to follow up that, actually, it was Fernie in 2018 where 3 people died from a small ammonia leak at their farm.
And that's changed absolutely how we operate arenas across the province, and if not across the country. So there's been some things that we've had to do in relation to that. Have we not, Ms. Donato, just for safety concerns? So our staff is always on top of that safety stuff. What I was hoping not to do is to delve into line by line items with all of this stuff and just have that overarching discussion of the 3%, 4%, or 5%, rather than us get involved in at this stage of the game with these projects. Staff have figured it out amongst themselves as to what they feel they need for each of their departments. And I kind of thought we could have an overarching discussion as we started with where we go with this sort of thing. But it was some of you as council that wanted to have this discussion based on some of these projects. And so I was willing to, have a discussion with that. However, we're at this point now in my conversation with Ms. Moore, and what you heard from Mr. Parliament was that taking some of these projects out may not change anything as far as a percentage goes, and that we just move forward and they operate their department if they feel that they can get a savings. If you feel like we should say to them, yeah, we need to get rid of something to deal with this capital stuff, then by all means, maybe we should have that discussion with that department and see what they can do, or let Ms. Moore have that discussion with that department. So, Councilor Palmer.
Yeah. So on this, it's on this whole theme about the capital projects, and then where on the decision making, where do we belong on the decision making? And the cumulative effects, like we're very quickly to $500,000 on little things that, and that's, having these prudent discussions. So safety, yeah, very, very important. I could use the argument that's why we need a new arena, entirely, because we're addressing this over and over and over again, and we'll continue to have that discussion. So there's this cumulative effect.
Right.
And so, again, it's a little bit late in the game, but in a way not, because it's starting to set that tone. So whether this list stays as it is, I am suggesting that staff go back and say, okay, is this really, really important? And as we know, if we look back at the history, there's a lot of capital projects that just simply don't get done. And so, that's a whole nother dialogue. So that, we had the dialogue, for example, in the recording studio, there was a question mark there, was $10,000, but then Councillor Orlando said, okay, well, what about lost revenues? And then if you say lost revenues over 10 years, how much is that? And then the next dialogue, well, we have a library doing something. Is there something that could be done in our new multiplex that is better and cheaper and on the long run? So those kind of dialogues, having that sober second thought. There's others that I'm not sure about and maybe are too small, but if we look at the one that I think there is a bigger dialogue, because I'm a little bit confused, is on the fenced dog park. And, again, to me, there should be the dog park is a real easy, fairly low cost win for the community. We're one of the few communities that don't have a dog park, but is that really in there? And I think there was a bit of a contradiction with some of the other dialogue. That's why I was interested in that. To me, it's not, I don't need to get held up and, drill down, replace telephone systems and stuff like that. Very, very operational. But I think the overall, and then when we start to say, okay, well, all these little things add up, end up being big money, and that's can be what makes a difference between the legacy projects or not having legacy projects on that fiscal responsibility. So that's just kind of the general. So I'm happy with this conversation where it's at right now. If that's sufficient, I'm okay with that as well. But I'll just bring up one more. Sorry, Mayor Souls. You know, the front counter, I don't think we've had that dialogue, and you know, right, every CAO, including back to a time that I remember well, CAOs bring in these capital projects on fixing City Hall, and it doesn't matter how many CAOs we go through, City Hall does not function very well as a City Hall. It's the makeup is there. And you know, to me, there's almost this question that begs is front counter, does that belong in the multiplex? And we're not going to answer those questions right now, but it's, you know, we've spent a lot on City Hall during your term as mayor, Mayor Souls. And so, hopefully we keep Evan for a long, long time, which I'm confident we will, so that we don't do this again.
Good cover. All right, so I am going to go back to you as a group. As Councillor Palmer has said, I'm comfortable with what's here. I'm quite comfortable with what our staff have proposed, rather than us crossing in at this late date into some of these things, is to let staff look themselves if they feel that there's some savings. And I'm going to suggest that they've already done that, and they've looked at that. But you know, Ms. Moore, how do you feel? Is there further conversation that you can have with your directors, or do you feel that that conversation has been had with what we have presented in front of us?
Through your worship, the entire management team did meet at the beginning of January and reviewed all of the capital projects together and prioritized them and came up with a recommended list. Are you able to see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay. This was the original list of spending packages that were brought forward for capital. And the ones highlighted in gray are the ones being recommended to council. And the rest you'll see a note of either pending or grant dependent. And pending basically means we will revisit them. I did want to just quickly clarify the fenced dog park and the disc golf course. The disc golf course is now entirely externally funded. It's funded through a CBT grant and RMI. Right. And the fenced dog park, we're actually hoping to just fund it entirely out of RMI within the $75,000 budget. However, my understanding is they're not as far into the planning process as the disc golf course. So staff have already, this is the original list in the 100-page long-term financial plan, have already gone through and identified a significant number of projects that we could hold off on and revisit in the future and prioritize once we have more information after the DCC bylaw update and after going out for community engagement for the arena. So in my opinion, the list is already condensed. The other item I'd like to highlight for council is you will see there are some items being funded by restart funds. These are the COVID restart funds given by the province. They are a bit restrictive. It's mostly around emergency services and IT and lost operational revenue because of the pandemic. So those projects that are funded by restart, that is like a bit of a restricted reserve. It's segregated out. It's not as flexible as something like general capital. So I couldn't take the telephone system out and say, oh, I'll put that $20,000 towards a new arena because the restart funds were not able to do that with those funds.
Okay, that's kind of the information I believe that council needed to hear. At least in my mind, that's what I needed to hear. It kind of gives me a better understanding of this list. And I look at it, and bearing that in mind, I feel quite comfortable that you, as Director of Finance and your directors for your departments, have vetted this in a way that is suitable for us to move forward and just say, rather than get involved and mired in the operations, you guys have talked about this and dealt with it. So I'm quite prepared just to move forward. I'm looking for input from the rest of council. Any comments from Councilor Palmer?
I'm willing to put a motion that council consider the 5% tax increase scenario as proposed by the Director of Finance. And if there's a seconder, I'll speak to that motion.
Okay, so you're making that motion. Is there a seconder around the table for 5%? Councilor Bucel has his hand up, so you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I was careful on the wording. I put consider,
Yes.
because there's going to be this contradiction because the committee of the whole is saying 3%, the finance committee is saying consider 5%.
And we'll have that conversation
And we'll have
as a
that
group at the council
Council
table.
table.
Right, right. All right, so any further discussion on that motion? Know that we're considering that sort of thing. We will have that conversation around the council table and be able to make those decisions at that time. So we've got the low end at 3% and now the high end at 5%. And we'll have that discussion. Councilor Orlando, you have your hand up.
Yes, Your Worship, thank you. Sort of in discussion of the motion that's on the table, for me, in order to support a 5% increase, I would like there to be a set reserve fund for the arena project. Established in a way so as any funding above at least 3%, and I'd like to discuss that further maybe a little bit later on at the council table, is put into a reserve fund for that project and kept there for that project, assuming it goes ahead. If it doesn't, obviously we can use it for something else. But I think, on the background to this one is, in days past, it was council policy to, I don't know if it was policy, actually informal policy, to start paying for things that we are planning to do as soon as we can, and that's contained in this motion. But my concern is that number one, this will not be communicated to the community. The message will not get across if we just do 5%, and also things happen so that the fund could be used for something else. So yeah, in summary, I'd really like to see that anything above 3% put into a reserve fund.
Great comment. Ms. Moore, comment on that. Was that scenario kind of the intention when you brought the scenario forward, 3, 4, 5%, that those funds would go to a set arena fund?
Through your worship, my intent was to build the current reserves until a funding strategy was made for the arena. However, we can certainly accelerate to create a separate reserve for the arena in order to accommodate council's motions. And it is easier from a financial planning and tracking point of view to have a separate reserve. And it is in the plan with the current funding strategy that we're working through for the arena. At the moment, it could be transferred to a current reserve with the motion to have it segregated until we have set up a new reserve. We currently do this with, for example, our RCFC legacy funds. It's currently part of our general capital reserve. However, it is segregated within that reserve. However, with the arena funding strategy, we were intending to create a new reserve specifically for that in the future.
Good. Thank you for that comment. Councilor Palmer, I know the motion on the table is about considering 5%. Do you want to weigh in on anything further? Are you okay? with
Yeah, no, I do. So I'm going to propose an amendment to the motion and add the words, the amending motion would be to add the words with the condition that the additional funds be set aside as a reserve for the future multiplex/arena project.
All right, so Miss, are you okay with that? Councilor Lucio is okay with that? Ms. Russo, did you get that, that information for the record on that motion?
Through your worship, not quite. I have that council consider the 5% tax increase proposed by the Director of Finance with the condition that the additional funds be set aside.
Councilor Palmer, carry on.
I'll read it out with the condition that the additional funds be set aside as a reserve fund for the future multiplex/arena project. And just to clarify, I'm happy to leave it as a friendly amendment. I was kind of interested in Councillor Orlando's if that was satisfying his concerns.
So Ms. Russo, I'll just ask, have you got that now?
I do, your worship. Thank you.
All right, Councillor Orlando, comment on that.
Your worship, thank you. My question is just on the actual breakdown. Are we looking at a 3% increase with 2% put into reserve? Is just to clarify.
Ms. Moore, comment, please.
That was the intent.
That was the intent of Councillor Palmer's motion.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Orlando?
Yeah, your worship, it does. And I have one comment, and I would like to thank Councillor Palmer for the question. I guess my thought is, as we go through this, I'm not really sure. We've got a bunch of things on the agenda today. I wasn't too sure when we would actually be getting down to this sort of brass tacks percentage suggestion, just because further down I was sort of thinking maybe closer to the end of the agenda, we would make this recommendation. However, I appreciate the concession, but my thought is this, that we need to be realistic with the taxpayers. We're heading in that direction, and we need to give them a taste of what's to come, because they need to be as eyes wide open as possible about the implications of a major capital project. It's great that we're seeking alternative sources of funding. However, I think a reality-based assessment is there's no way we're going to complete this project without taking the lion's share of costs for our taxpayers. So my sense would be to increase the reserve amount at this point to at least 5%, which is even lower than the lowest case scenario of future costs. And to offset that, ask for staff to reduce the 3% proposed increase to 1% for a total of 6% increase, 5% of which would be dedicated to this reserve. And that's my thought. I'm not making that motion at this point, just putting it out there for discussion.
I appreciate that. My conversation with definitely with Mr. Parliament on this is there may be other ways to find funding for this initiative when we start talking about some sort of facility capital project, whether we haven't really shaken the trees of public-private partnerships or what we can do or where we can find funding and that sort of thing. And so I don't want this to look like we're putting everything on the taxpayers' back when we move forward. I want to look at all kinds of alternative initiatives when we come to spending money of that magnitude for our community. And that doesn't mean that we can't be talking about what the motions on the table and alternatives that you're looking at, but I don't want us to be pigeonholed into saying that's exactly what we need to do when there may be alternatives. But the reality of this is this is going to be a community decision, and the community will weigh in and give us the benefit of their input. And they may say to us, no, I don't want this sort of thing. We need to look at all of those things. And as I don't want to short circuit the communication that's coming out that staff have worked on when it comes to the communication plan for the arena. And so that's kind of why I'm okay with considering something to go to council. That gives our staff an understanding of what we're thinking, but also they're able to get their communication plan out to us and out to the community and say, this is kind of what we're thinking. Well, I don't think we've gone down the path as to initially what we're going to have to do or not do, other than we know we need to fix or replace. And I don't think we can fix anymore from what I'm hearing from our engineers. So I just wanted to make that statement. So with the motion on the table that Councillor Palmer's put forward, seconded by Councillor Luciano, it's been amended now to kind of consider that at the council table. Are you as councillors comfortable with voting on that and we move forward? And there are other things on the agenda that we should touch on before we end this. So Councillor Palmer, comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Souls. And to nail this down absolutely accurately right now isn't important. It's a advisory to council, so it gives us time. Having said that, I kind of like some of the ideas that Councillor Orlando was doing there, so I don't want to create this too complicated, make it overly complicated. We could leave it as it is with the friendly amendment, or as it was originally, and then or address these things later on. As you know, I'd certainly like to hear some of those ideas unpacked a little bit more from Councillor Orlando. It's a different sort of realm. So there was a certain amount of attraction to that though, but yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So with the amended motion on the table, it's there. Ms. Moore, comment? You have your hand up.
Oh, through your worship, I wanted to note that we will be coming back with a funding strategy for council that will kind of incorporate what will be required each year to transfer to this specific reserve and how much. So I just want to preface that there is more coming around this, and you will see it going into 2024 budget planning, and that this year we can leave it a little bit more vague or simple, and then we can really dive into a funding strategy that's a bit more specific going forward. And that might be the best solution at the moment, given where we're at in the budgeting process.
All right, thank you for that. So in light of that, I'd like to call the question on the motion on the table and then get back to the agenda. Are you comfortable with that, council? All right, all those in favor? Opposed? No, motion's carried. Thank you. Ms. Moore, could you share your screen back to or Ms. Rousseau back to the agenda? Unfortunately, I neglected to bring that with me or print it off, so. Okay, so we basically had a conversation in my mind regarding the long-term financial plan. Do you, as a council, want to discuss any of the public engagement or that sort of thing, or what we talked about in committee of the whole suitable to you? Any comments? Councillor Stapenhurst.
Just on the one poll, I want to say that 56.3% were in favor of a 3% raise. So just want to make sure that that's clear for the record.
Okay, so noted.
Thank you.
We're trying to make that larger so this little guy can see it, or? Councillor Plum.
Yeah, so to answer your question, Mayor Souls, I'd certainly like to drill down into much more detail, spend a few more hours. However, well, to let that go, I would point out, that pictures can be very compelling. And I think Councillor Orlando did sort of correct us a little bit, saying the statistical relevance of that pie chart is questionable at best, kind of thing. So, and as we move ahead and provide more information, I think that's where we have some decisions to make.
Okay. Councillor Staplener, you still have your hand up. Do you have something further? Nope. All right. So going back to new business. So I feel we've dealt with the long-term financial plan. I'd like to move on to property tax distribution report and talk about rates and ratios, if we may. Is that something that we could do at this point, Ms. Moore?
Through your worship, yes, we can do that at this point. I will share my screen and pull up some of the new documents that I added. Councillor Cherry did ask to see what it would look like to transfer 1% of the commercial to residential, the
Right.
business other class. And so can you see my screen?
We can, thank you.
Okay, just checking. And so I've given 3 different options of a 1% shift, a 2% shift, and a 3% shift at the 3% recommendation from Thursday.
Right.
So if they were to shift 1%, it would then be 3.79% taxation increase for the residential class and about 1.97% for the business other class. And you can see it kind of follow the same trend here as more gets shifted if council were to shift the burden. And then I have also provided council with the historical rates and ratios back to 1996. I did find these in a spreadsheet. I wasn't able to verify them all, but I did find that it was interesting to see how pre-Ski Hill we were at about a 3-to-1 ratio. And as you get to 2007 and 2008, it jumps right up. And that is as a result of the change in assessed values for residential properties as they're assessed at market values and businesses are assessed at an income-based approach. And so the motions on the table. We have 3 options here that I'll review again with you. So option 1, which is the recommended option, since we are in compliance with our current policy that requires that 50% of the taxation base is residential. Council applies a tax rate increase equally across all property tax classifications. So everyone gets the same rate increase. Any excess non-market change received will be transferred to reserves for future major projects. So there is potentially an extra $60,000 that we are going to get this year in non-market change based off of what we had budgeted as our non-market change and new development revenue did go up from the preliminary roll received from BC Assessment versus the roll received in January. And option 2, council applies a tax rate increase equally across all property tax classifications. So again, all classifications have the same taxation increase. However, any excess non-market change received will be used to reduce taxation in a specific property classification. So for example, that $60,000 of excess that we're potentially getting, we could use that to reduce the burden for the business other class or a different classification if council chooses to do so. Option 3, council chooses to incrementally shift the tax burden from one class to another, resulting in one property tax classification with a lower tax percentage increase and one or more tax classifications with a higher tax percentage increase. And so this is the example that I just showed where you could shift from residential to commercial, and we have historically done that. However, we are currently in compliance with the current policy. And if council does choose to go with a higher tax rate, that might be something to consider as well. The example I gave was at a 3% taxation increase. In my opinion, both option 1 and option 2 are good options this year, especially option 2. If you are going to go with a 5% increase, you could alleviate the business other class a little bit with that excess non-market change that we might be receiving. When I originally made the recommendation for option 1, which is any excess non-market change will be transferred to future major projects, I was working under the assumption of a 3% taxation increase. So really just trying to build those reserves for future projects.
Okay, thank you for that. So I do have a question, an accounting question. So when we talk about residential taxes, the residents cannot write off their taxes on their income, right? So they don't get a reduction. I know that at least my accountant's not letting me take what I pay for taxes and write it off when it comes to my personal stuff. What about commercial? So that's a business expense. Can that not be written off based on income?
Through your worship, that's correct that as a business or a commercial operating property, you can write off property taxes from your income, where most residents will pay for their property taxes with after-tax income. So if you're just living in your standard 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom family residential home and you have employment income, you cannot write off the taxes from your income. So you're paying them with post-income tax dollars. I will note that if you are someone with a rental suite or you're claiming rental income, for those that actually claim it, you can write it off.
Okay, thank you for that. I just wanted that to kind of be clear around the table. So council, any comments on the tax distribution? So Councillor Cherry, you were asking for some scenarios, and do you feel with what you're seeing that you would like to propose something? How do you think?
I don't know if I'm ready to propose something right now, but I do appreciate that, Your Worship. The reason I wanted to see these numbers was just to see what the impact would be per household versus business, business other. Yeah, there's a couple councillors missing for this, so we did defer it till today. I'd love to hear going around the table what everybody else's interest lies.
Any comments from any council? Councillor Orlando and Councillor Dublin.
Your Worship, thank you. Just a general question to Mayor and Council. What would be the rationale for changing it from what was originally recommended? That's the basic question. Yeah, what would be the rationale for doing something different?
I think what we heard from the chamber was, can we reduce taxes for those in the commercial market? I think that was tax ratio, pardon me. Whether we could reduce that tax ratio for the commercial. That was the reason for asking for these questions, Councillor Orlando. Councillor Devlin, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just going to make a general comment on this. This is really interesting stuff, and this is kind of where I was going with my original question. Committee of the whole, as well as I kind of wanted to see these numbers. if we are talking about considering a 5% increase, I don't think I would be in favor of shifting the ratio as well, as judging by these numbers, based on the 3% increase, you would actually be seeing an extra roughly 2.5% to residential in that case. So if we take that ratio forward, a 5% would end up being somewhere in the 8% sort of scenario, which is, yeah, quite high in my opinion to put onto the residential. I am very interested in seeing ways that in the future we might be able to close that gap, and I would be very interested in exploring the proposed option number 2, where we can use money that we would in a 5% scenario no longer particularly need to put into reserves to help alleviate a little bit of the tax burden on businesses. But I don't think I particularly would support both a 5% increase and a shift from tax ratios. That's just the general comment.
Thank you. Any other comments from council? Councilor Palmer and then Councilor Orlando.
Yeah, just further to Councilor Orlando's question. The chamber chair and executive director are here in attendance, so it's the chamber's doing what chambers do and doing a good job with their new executive director and of lobbying on behalf of the business community, and I certainly appreciate that. That they are actively interested in what we're doing and good watchdogs. The struggle of it whenever councils are dealing with these sort of racial questions of residential business, and often it's avoided, I would say, in many communities. Just it isn't highlighted unless somebody like the chamber is highlighting. And the time that it usually gets highlighted from my experience is when there's a discrepancy in which the chamber is suggesting there's a discrepancy, and we've seen the historical numbers, which is interesting. The other thing that triggers that is when businesses are really, really hurting. That's when they're shutting down, and then communities, you'll see that in remote communities, northern communities. They'll drive their business taxes way down because they need to, because they're just losing their business altogether. Right. So that will trigger. My sense is, there's more challenges with getting workers rather than, that's probably the thing that's hurting profits more than anything else. Now, I suspect, I don't really know for sure, but so it ends up being this struggle. And then as soon as you start talking one way or the other, okay, if somebody gets a benefit, then
somebody else doesn't.
Somebody else, it's going the other way.
Yeah.
And so that's, the overall tax burden is an important question, how we're doing that. So I really don't have a position. I probably, if anything, I'm sort of leaning to the option 1, and I would encourage, I'm sure the chamber will continue to, will continue to lobby, even if it's through body language, in the future. So I think it's something that will be on our radar screen for the entire term of this council.
Great. Councilor Orlando.
Your worship, thank you. Just a general comment for council and anyone listening in. This is the 15th budget cycle I've sat through here, and I appreciate the input from the Chamber of Commerce. They have consistently over that period of time provided input to the city on the budget cycle, and that's always appreciated. I did have an opportunity at the Affordable Housing Summit to chat with the executive director, Carolyn LaChapelle. It was great to meet her and hear some of the concerns. My general philosophy, to boil it down, is number 1, slow and steady wins the race if we're adjusting ratios. Number 2, it should be a purpose-driven policy where we've got a goal that's laid out. It's not a annual adjustment that we do based on input. It should be for a reason. And to give a little bit of background, the city has intentionally adjusted this ratio over the years to shift more of the burden onto residential properties. There was an unwritten and unspoken policy, this is back in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, dividing it 50-50 or something like that. And that has been slowly adjusted. And that's largely was largely in response to the reality that residential properties had gone from 150,000 for your average home up to, 500. And now we're at 708, I think this year. And that there were gains there and on property value that would be realized on sale. So that's my general philosophy, is that if we're going to change something, we should the ratio, we should do it slowly and with purpose. And the final statement is, I think the place to make real hard savings for businesses and residential ratepayers is with the overall budget, not how we slice it up. And that means looking at what our overall increase or decrease is going to be, not so much ad hoc adjustments at the last minute. So that's my general preference and policy. Thank you.
Great. Any further comment from council? So do you feel that we should recommend any of these options to council from the finance committee? Or are you okay leaving it? We'll have this further discussion around the council table. Councillor Palmer, comment?
Yeah, I liked Councillor Orlando's thoughtful and methodical sort of approach to that. And if I was to put it in different words, is don't make a change right now based on just, and that probably doesn't really satisfy the chamber a whole lot, but the conversation on the policy, perhaps at the next finance committee, after we get through the budget, saying, okay, well, what should this policy be? And Councillor Orlando said that it was an unwritten policy. I think it may have been a written policy because it was very methodical over time. So, reviewing what those policies are, we have a new finance director, and sort of, maybe weighing at when we have a little bit of a pause of time, possibly inviting the chamber into that discussion at a future finance committee. This is a possibility.
Great. And so either Ms. Moore or Ms. Rousseau, the proportionate tax burden borne by the residential sector has been less than 50%. Is council's intention this proportionate share increase to at least 50%. This may occur as a result of a natural growth in assessment value by shifting the burden from the non-residential sector through applying different tax increases to the various classes, or through a combination of both methods over time. So that was back when Mr. McPhee was CAO. We're dating that to when?
2008.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay, there we go, 2008. Yep, thank you. All right, so that kind of gives us that that principle back then. So I think we can have further discussion as we move along, as Councillor Palmer has said, with finance after we get the budget complete. But so I'll go around the table one more time. Is there any movement? Do you want to do a tax ratio consideration for council, or leave it and we'll discuss it one more time at the council table? Councillor Palmer.
So I'll make a motion that the finance committee review the policy F9 at a future finance committee meeting.
All right, second for that motion. Councillor Cherry. Any further discussion on that motion? All those in favor? Opposed? No. Motion's carried unanimously. Thank you. All right, so I'm not seeing any appetite to change things. We'll deal with that down the road. Can we go back to the agenda again, Ms. Moore, so I can have another look at it? Okay, so we dealt with the tax distribution going down to grants and aid 2023. Do we want to have a look at that sort of thing? How do you feel, council?
Mayor Schultz.
Yes, sir.
I feel like I should recuse myself from this discussion as I have ongoing relationships with one or more organizations on the list.
All right, good. Thank you for bringing that up. Councilor Orlando.
Yeah, sort of a point of order on that. I don't know if it's worthy of a point of order, but point of discussion maybe. Regarding, I don't know, and while Councillor Luciao, if you just want to hang tough in the room there for a second. Regarding sort of omnibus decisions, I think it's the councillor does not necessarily need to recuse himself if we have a list of 30 people up for funding and we're voting on it in bulk. If we are breaking things out and having discussions about individual items with which he has a conflict, then that would be a conflict. Ultimately, a declaration of conflict is the decision based on advice for each individual councillor. So it's not us to decide whether Councillor Luciao should declare conflict at this point, but I just wanted to have a discussion on that because that has been the policy in the past, in that we can either break out 3 or 4 things that, if he's like on the skating club and works for Community Connections, for example, then he can recuse himself. And I'm just seeking any just sort of general review of the community charter on this one, maybe from the CAO. Yeah.
So, Mr. Mayor, totally agree what was just said. I don't feel you're in conflict, but it's always good to acknowledge a potential conflict. The bottom line is if an elected official feels uncomfortable participating in any discussion, you always err on the side of caution and just recuse yourself. Anytime an elected official makes an acknowledgement that he or she is in conflict, it's always a fine line, and it's a very ambiguous legal definition of whether or not you're in conflict or not. You're not receiving any payment. No different than Councillor Orlando recusing himself on the Mountaineer receiving ad revenues from a certain either applicant, etc. He's not receiving any monetary benefit. And so it's always a fine line. It just gets down to your comfort level. And in this case, because we're dealing with a lot of grants, I don't believe you are in conflict. But if there's any one particular grant that you feel, you know what, I'd rather just excuse myself, then you feel free to do that. That's a decision you can make. It's a tricky one. I go through this every council. There is all kinds of municipal law seminars on this topic, none of which you're breaking any conflict of interest rules. You're not receiving any monetary gain by participating in these discussions because it's going from, the grant aid program to recipients. So I'm comfortable with you staying. However, if you feel on one particular grant, you should, that's a decision you can make, and I know council will respect it. Thank you.
How do you feel?
Thank you. I am going to step out for this conversation.
All right. Good. Councilor.
If I may, before you do.
Yeah.
Because I tend to concur. So what went through my mind as soon as you were doing that, is kind of knew there were 1 or 2 that likely there. I thought, oh, I better go do a quick scan and see if I've got something on there. So again, I'm not going to reiterate whatever has been said there because it is your decision. One solution is to take those out, just separate them so that you're here for the conversation, but maybe we're overthinking this as well. So, yeah.
So we'll leave it to you.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Thanks later.
All right. So can we bring back the list up for me if you don't mind, please? And so, quite often, we will go through this very quickly. And so there's some recommendations here, and those will be based on what staff feel is available and how they have been researched and really what people have received in the past. Is that not correct, Ms. Moore?
Through your worship, that is correct. Both Ms. Donato and I have reviewed this list. Some of these are in kind grants, so free use of a facility, and some of them are cash. What we typically do is we try to leave some room for late applicants. So our total recommended amount, this might be a bit small. Can you see it, by the way?
If you can make it just a little larger, that would be good.
The total recommended amount for each organization is 23, or as a whole is $23,615. And this just leaves a little bit of excess if anyone or any group has a late application for grant and aid. Every
We have a
year.
total of 25,000 recommended, correct? The total amount that we have available is 25,000, is that correct?
That's correct. Every year we budget 25,000 for grant and aid.
Okay, thank you for that. Councilor Palmer, comment?
I'll put a motion to endorse staff recommendation of grant and aid.
Okay, second for that motion. Councilor Devlin, any further discussion on the motion? That's to endorse everything that staff have gone through. They've vetted it, gone through it, feel it's appropriate. I have sat at that table many times over the years and feel that staff are actually the best ones to vet this, and I'm very comfortable with what their decisions are and their recommendations. So any further comment from council? Councilor Cherry.
I'm just curious what the plan is with, say, the remaining 1,500.
That's if we get some late applications, and then so some people don't apply for 2 or 3 months because their financial needs don't come up. Is that correct, Ms. Moore?
That's correct, through your worship.
Yeah, and then so they like to have a little bit of a buffer so that they can look at those that come in because they're, either the year end or whatever the situation is, and they apply late. They don't apply late intentionally because they want to skip this. They apply late because they don't have their needs or whatever. They won't know what their needs are for a period of time yet. So that's the reason. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Have I muddied the waters more?
I was just curious how late is late. So we're already looking at 22 days after. So I'm just curious how long that lasts.
Ms. Moore, comment?
Through your worship, we do receive late applications throughout the year. Not very many, and most of them are minimal. And it's exactly as you described. It's usually these one-off situations where community group would love to use the recreational rooms for free rental to help offset costs for whatever event or fundraiser they're doing.
Does that make it clear? Councilor Plum.
Yeah, so this discussion comes up every year. And so just on principle, if they just haven't got their act together, then we shouldn't be giving late, but there's these exceptions that come up. And so again, this is a pretty small amount. And so, yeah.
And it almost always is in donation in kind rather than a cash. And so what we do is we will bill this if they need a room in the community center. My understanding is community center will bill the grant and aid for that. So it's covered. It's like if we're billing out equipment from one department to another. Is that correct, Ms. Donato? Is that how it works, or am I way off base?
Not completely off base. So we do invoice the event organizer, and then we just apply the grant and aid to the payment. So it's an internal transfer that's done through the finance department.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, bearing that in mind, any further comments on grant and aid? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All those in favor? Opposed? No, motion's carried. Thank you. All right, so we're at the end of our agenda. Is that correct, Ms. Moore?
Your worship, that is correct.
All right, so I'm going to call for a basically termination of the meeting. Councillor Orlando, you have your hand up, or are you moving that motion?
I think we should invite Councillor Lucio back in.
I didn't see myself.
Oh, is
I
it?
think he's left.
Oh, he's gone. Okay.
So thank you for that. All right. So now I'm going to ask for a motion to terminate. Can we do that again? Councillor Stapenhurst. Yes, you got it. Who's seconding that? Councillor Devlin. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank